They tell you the problem is you, that you are not skilled enough, not disciplined enough, not grateful enough. They tell you that if you struggle, it is because you have failed to compete, failed to adapt, failed to deserve a dignified life. This is the first and most profitable lie of the system, that your suffering is personal, not political, individual, not structural. While you doubt yourself, the system secures itself. While you turn inward in shame, it marches outward in power. Capital does not rule by chains alone, it rules by ideas. It trains you to question your worth, while never questioning its own legitimacy. It demands your labor, your time, your creativity, and then convinces you that the poverty you endure is a natural outcome of the world as it is. But there is nothing natural about exploitation. There is nothing inevitable about inequality. These conditions are produced, designed, by a mode of production that thrives on your doubt and depends on your isolation. Under capitalism, labor is reduced to a commodity, bought at the lowest possible cost and sold for the highest possible profit. The worker creates wealth but is denied ownership of it. The more you produce, the poorer you become in spirit and security, while a small class accumulates power without labor. This is not mismanagement. It is the system functioning exactly as intended. The wage conceals exploitation. The contract masks coercion. Freedom is proclaimed, yet necessity forces you to sell your labor to survive. And to keep this order intact, the system wages a constant war on consciousness. It fragments you into competitors, not comrades. It teaches you to compare rather than unite, to blame rather than understand. It glorifies the few who rise while silencing the millions who are crushed beneath the same structure. When you doubt yourself, you do not see your neighbor as an ally, you see them as a rival. Thus the working class is divided against itself, and capital stands unchallenged. But history does not move by illusion forever. Every system produces not only its wealth, but its contradictions. Capitalism concentrates workers in factories, offices and platforms, binding them together in shared conditions of exploitation. In doing so, it forges the very force capable of ending it. The proletariat is not a collection of failures. It is a class deprived of what it produces. Its power lies not in individual escape, but in collective action. Understand this clearly. Your insecurity is not a weakness. It is evidence of a system that cannot grant stability without sacrificing profit. Your exhaustion is not laziness. It is the mark of surplus labor extracted from your life. Your anxiety is not a personal flaw. It is the psychological cost of an economy that treats humans as expendable inputs. When you recognize this, doubt gives way to clarity, and clarity becomes the seed of resistance. The ruling ideas of any age are the ideas of the ruling class. They will tell you that this system is eternal, that alternatives are unrealistic, that organization is dangerous. They fear nothing more than a working class that understands itself as a class. For once workers see their shared position in the relations of production, the spell is broken. Exploitation is revealed not as fate, but as theft. Do not wait for liberation to be granted. Rights are never given freely, they are won through struggle. Organize in your workplaces, in your communities, in every space where labor is exploited and dignity denied. Replace competition with solidarity. Replace doubt with analysis. Replace isolation with collective power. The emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself. A new world is not born from hope alone, but from struggle informed by understanding. When you stop doubting yourself, you begin to see the system for what it is. And when the oppressed see clearly, no force can indefinitely suppress them. The system profits when you doubt yourself. Its end begins when you no longer do. Self-doubt is not an accidental byproduct of modern life. It is a carefully produced condition essential to the survival of capitalist power. Capitalism cannot rely on open force alone to extract labor and maintain domination, because constant coercion would expose its true nature. Instead, it works more efficiently by turning the worker against themselves, encouraging an internalized discipline that polices thought, ambition, and self-worth. When individuals believe their struggles are the result of personal inadequacy rather than structural exploitation, resistance dissolves before it can even take shape. The worker questions their value instead of questioning the system that profits from their labor, and this misdirection is one of capitalism's most effective weapons. Under capitalism, success is framed as a moral achievement and failure as a personal flaw. Productivity becomes a measure of human worth, and wages are presented as fair reflections of effort and talent. In reality, wages are determined by power relations, not justice, but the ideology of merit conceals this truth. Workers are taught that if they work harder, improve themselves, or remain patient, they will eventually be rewarded. When those rewards never arrive, self-doubt fills the gap left by broken promises. Instead of recognizing exploitation, individuals internalize blame, believing they are insufficient, unskilled, or undeserving of stability and dignity. This manufactured self-doubt serves capital by preventing class consciousness. A worker who doubts themselves does not see their condition as shared, they see it as isolated. They do not recognize that millions experience the same insecurity, precarity, and exhaustion. Capitalism fragments the working class into competing individuals, each chasing survival while fearing replacement. This competition is not natural but engineered, as scarcity is maintained to discipline labor and suppress wages. Self-doubt thrives in this environment because fear thrives where solidarity is absent, and fear ensures compliance without the need for constant repression. The education system, the workplace, and the media all participate in reinforcing this doubt. Schools prepare individuals not to understand society critically, but to adapt obediently to the labor market. Workplaces evaluate, monitor, and rank workers, cultivating anxiety and dependence rather than confidence and autonomy. Media celebrates exceptional success stories while ignoring systemic barriers, suggesting that anyone who fails simply did not try hard enough. These institutions appear neutral, but they function together as ideological machinery, shaping consciousness in ways that protect existing power relations. Alienation deepens this process. The worker is separated from the product of their labor, from the process of production, from their fellow workers, and ultimately from their own human potential. When labor becomes something imposed rather than chosen, creativity and purpose are stripped away. The individual feels empty, disconnected, and powerless, yet capitalism reframes this alienation as a personal psychological issue rather than a social condition. Self-help replaces collective struggle, therapy replaces transformation, and coping mechanisms replace resistance. The system encourages workers to manage their despair rather than confront its cause. Self-doubt also neutralizes anger, which is a dangerous emotion for those in power. Anger directed outward becomes protest, organization, and rebellion. Anger directed inward becomes shame, depression, and resignation. Capitalism depends on the latter. By convincing workers that they are the problem, it prevents them from seeing exploitation as unjust and unnecessary. A doubting worker seeks approval from the very structures that exploit them, hoping to be recognized, promoted, or spared, rather than imagining a world beyond wage labor and domination. Yet this doubt is fragile because it contradicts lived reality. Workers know they work hard. They know they produce value far beyond what they receive. They know that insecurity persists no matter how obedient or efficient they become. These contradictions generate cracks in the ideological facade, moments when doubt can be redirected away from the self and toward the system. When workers speak to one another, organize together, and analyze their conditions collectively, self-doubt begins to dissolve. What once felt like personal failure is revealed as a shared condition imposed by an economic order built on inequality. Capitalism profits from self-doubt because it turns domination into consent. It transforms exploitation into inevitability and resistance into irrationality. But this process is neither permanent nor complete. Consciousness is shaped by material conditions, and as contradictions sharpen, the ruling ideas lose their grip. When workers recognize that their doubt was manufactured, that their insecurity was engineered, and that their suffering is rooted in class relations, the psychological foundations of capitalist power begin to erode. The moment doubt shifts from the self to the system, obedience gives way to awareness, and awareness opens the path toward collective action and revolutionary possibility, where individuals no longer ask what is wrong with them, but begin to ask what kind of society demands so much while giving so little, and why those who create all wealth are taught to feel unworthy of it, while those who exploit labor are celebrated as visionaries and benefactors of humanity. And this recognition spreads not through inspiration alone, but through shared struggle and material understanding, as workers reclaim their confidence not as isolated individuals, but as a class aware of its historical role and latent power. Exploitation is not the result of personal weakness, poor choices, or moral failure. It is a structural condition embedded in the very foundations of capitalist society. The system requires exploitation to function, just as it requires profit, accumulation, and inequality. From the moment labor becomes a commodity sold for survival, exploitation ceases to be an accident and becomes a necessity. The worker does not enter the labor market as a free and equal participant, but as someone compelled by material need to sell their time, energy, and creative capacity in exchange for wages that never reflect the full value they produce. This imbalance is not caused by individual shortcomings, but by a social order designed to extract surplus from the many for the benefit of the few. Capitalism disguises this structural reality by promoting the myth of equal opportunity. It insists that everyone begins from the same position and that outcomes are determined by effort and talent alone. This illusion serves to obscure the real relations of production, where ownership of the means of production grants power and non-ownership enforces dependence. Workers do not fail because they lack discipline or ambition. They struggle because they do not own what they need to live independently. The capitalist owns factories, land, machines, platforms, and capital itself, while the worker owns only their capacity to labor. This asymmetry ensures exploitation regardless of individual behavior. When wages fail to cover basic needs, when workers remain insecure despite long hours, when poverty persists alongside unprecedented wealth, the system redirects blame away from itself. Individuals are told to reskill, work harder, or accept sacrifice as a virtue. Structural exploitation is reframed as personal inadequacy. This narrative is essential to maintaining order, because a worker who believes their suffering is self-inflicted will seek self-correction rather than systemic change. Shame replaces anger, and resignation replaces resistance. Exploitation operates through laws, institutions, and economic norms that appear neutral but consistently favor capital. Labor contracts present exploitation as voluntary exchange, ignoring the coercion of necessity. Property rights are treated as sacred, while the right to a dignified life is treated as conditional. Productivity increases through technology and intensification of labor, yet wages stagnate, revealing that exploitation deepens even as society grows richer. These outcomes are not failures of policy or morality. They are expressions of a system whose logic prioritizes accumulation over human well-being. The workplace itself reinforces the idea of individual failure. Performance metrics, rankings, and surveillance isolate workers and encourage self-blame. Success is individualized, while exploitation is collectivized. Workers are rewarded just enough to remain hopeful, but never enough to become free. Those who cannot keep up are discarded, replaced, or labeled unproductive, further reinforcing the belief that survival is a personal achievement rather than a collective struggle. In this way, exploitation reproduces itself not only economically but psychologically. Alienation intensifies this condition. Workers are separated from the products they create, which confront them as commodities owned by others. They are separated from the process of production, reduced to repetitive tasks, dictated by efficiency rather than purpose. They are separated from one another, forced into competition for wages and security. Finally, they are separated from their own human potential, unable to see themselves as creative, social beings, capable of shaping their world. This alienation is not an emotional accident, but a structural outcome of wage labor under capitalism. Exploitation persists because it is normalized. It is woven into everyday life so thoroughly that it appears unavoidable. Long hours, exhaustion, insecurity, and debt are treated as facts of life rather than political conditions. Those who question this order are dismissed as unrealistic or ungrateful, while those who endure it silently are praised as responsible. The system depends on this normalization, because once exploitation is recognized as structural, its legitimacy collapses. History shows that exploitation is not eternal. Social systems rise and fall according to their contradictions. Capitalism's greatest contradiction is that it depends on workers while denying them power, security, and control over their own labor. As exploitation intensifies, so too does the potential for consciousness. When workers recognize that their struggles are shared, that their exhaustion is produced, and that their insecurity is engineered, the narrative of individual failure begins to unravel. What was once experienced as personal defeat becomes understood as collective dispossession, and this understanding carries within it the possibility of resistance, organization, and transformation as workers cease to ask how they failed and begin to ask why a system built on their labor treats their survival as optional and their dignity as negotiable, and why those who create all value are denied control over the conditions of their existence, while a minority claims ownership of the world they did not build. Class division is not an unfortunate side effect of capitalism, it is one of its most essential mechanisms of control. The system survives by ensuring that workers do not recognize themselves as a unified class with shared interests and shared power. Instead, it fractures them along lines of race, nationality, religion, gender, skill, income, and status, transforming potential comrades into competitors. When workers are divided, they struggle against one another for survival rather than confronting the structure that exploits them all. Capital depends on this fragmentation because a united working class would immediately threaten the foundations of its power. Under capitalism, scarcity is not merely economic, it is social and psychological. Jobs are limited, wages are suppressed, and security is made conditional, creating an environment where workers are forced to compete for basic necessities. This competition is then naturalized, presented as human nature rather than a manufactured condition. Workers are told that their co-workers are obstacles to success, that migrants steal jobs, that the unemployed are lazy, that those who earn slightly more are enemies, while those who earn vastly more remain invisible. In this way, anger is redirected sideways instead of upward, diffused across the working class rather than concentrated against capital. The ruling class has always understood that its greatest danger lies in working class unity. History shows that when workers organize collectively, they can halt product, ion, disrupt profit, and force concessions that no individual could ever secure alone. This is why capital invests so heavily in division. Ideologies are promoted that emphasize individual identity without addressing material conditions, or national loyalty without class solidarity. Workers are encouraged to see themselves first as isolated individuals or competing groups, not as members of a class bound together by their relation to production. Even within workplaces, division is carefully cultivated. Hierarchies are created to separate workers into ranks, titles, and pay grades, fostering resentment and false superiority. Supervisory roles are used to align a small segment of workers with management interests, while precarious contracts pit temporary workers against permanent ones. Performance metrics individualize success and failure, obscuring the collective nature of production. Though wealth is created socially, recognition and reward are distributed individually, reinforcing the illusion that advancement comes through personal effort rather than collective power. This division weakens workers not only materially but mentally. A divided class cannot see itself clearly. Workers experiencing the same exploitation interpret it differently, blaming one another instead of the system that imposes it. Solidarity erodes, trust dissolves, and isolation becomes the dominant experience of labor. In such conditions, fear replaces confidence. Workers hesitate to organize, to speak, to resist, because they believe they stand alone. Capital requires this fear, because fear ensures obedience without the need for constant force. Unity, by contrast, exposes the fragility of the psi. STEM. When workers recognize their shared exploitation, they begin to act collectively. Unity transforms scattered grievances into organized demands. It reveals that profit depends entirely on labor, and that without workers, capital is inert. Strikes, boycotts, and mass movements have always terrified ruling classes precisely because they demonstrate this truth in practice. Unity makes visible what ideology seeks to hide, that workers are the creators of all wealth and therefore possess immense latent power. The system responds to this threat by criminalizing organization, weakening unions, and promoting narratives that depict collective struggle as dangerous or outdated. Workers are told that unity is unrealistic in a complex world, that solidarity is naive, that competition is inevitable. Yet these claims collapse under scrutiny. Capital itself operates collectively, coordinating across borders, industries, and institutions to protect its interests. Only workers are discouraged from doing the same, because worker unity would challenge ownership, profit, and control at their roots. True unity does not erase differences, it recognizes them within a shared material reality. Workers do not need identical experiences to share a common enemy. Exploitation adapts to different contexts, but its logic remains the same. Unity arises not from uniformity, but from understanding that every division among workers strengthens capital. When workers stand together across artificial boundaries, they deprive the system of its most reliable defense. As contradictions intensify, division becomes harder to sustain. Rising inequality, precarity, and crisis reveal that no segment of the working class is truly secure. Those once promised protection discover their vulnerability. In these moments, unity ceases to be an abstract ideal and becomes a material necessity. When workers unite, they do more than resist exploitation. They begin to imagine a different social order, one organized around human need rather than profit, cooperation rather than competition, collective ownership rather than private accumulation. And it is this possibility that the system fears most, because unity does not merely weaken capitalism, but points beyond it toward a future where labor governs itself and no class survives by dividing another. Consciousness is the first battlefield on which every system of domination secures its rule, because before people can resist collectively, they must first understand collectively. Exploitation can persist for generations not because it is invisible, but because it is misinterpreted. Workers feel exhaustion, insecurity, and deprivation, yet without consciousness, these experiences appear isolated, accidental, or deserved. Capitalism depends on this confusion. It allows suffering to be felt but not understood, experienced but not explained. As long as workers lack a clear understanding of their position within the relations of production, their discontent remains fragmented and politically harmless. Class consciousness does not arise automatically from suffering. Misery alone does not generate resistance. It often generates despair. The system ensures that pain is individualized, teaching people to interpret hardship as personal failure rather than social consequence. When workers lack consciousness, they may resent their conditions while still defending the system that produces them. They may blame themselves, their neighbors, or imagined enemies, while leaving untouched the structures that shape their lives. This is why consciousness must precede resistance, because without it, anger turns inward or sideways instead of outward toward the source of exploitation. Capitalism actively interferes with the development of consciousness. Through ideology, it presents existing social relations as natural and eternal. Wage labor is portrayed as freedom, competition as human nature, inequality as motivation, and poverty as a lesson. These ideas saturate education, media, culture, and everyday language, shaping how people interpret reality. Workers learn how to function within the system long before they learn how to question it. Consciousness is delayed, distorted, or suppressed because an aware working class would immediately recognize the injustice of a system that depends on their labor while denying them control over its products. Without consciousness, resistance lacks direction. Workers may protest symptoms without challenging causes. They may demand relief while accepting exploitation, reform while preserving domination. Consciousness provides the analytical clarity necessary to see beyond surface appearances and identify the underlying structure of power. It reveals that individual struggles are interconnected, that insecurity is systemic, and that exploitation is not a deviation but a requirement of capital accumulation. This understanding transforms scattered grievances into a shared perspective, turning isolated individuals into a class aware of itself. The development of consciousness is a social process, a private awakening. It emerges through shared experience, discussion, organization, and struggle. Workers come to understand their conditions by confronting them together, by comparing realities, by recognizing patterns that cannot be explained by personal effort alone. When workers speak openly about their labor, their wages, their exhaustion, and their fears, the illusion of individual failure begins to collapse. Consciousness grows where isolation breaks down and collective analysis takes root. This is why the system fears organization even before it fears resistance. Unions, assemblies, and movements are dangerous not only because they disrupt production, but because they create spaces where consciousness can develop. In these spaces, workers learn to articulate their experiences in political terms, to connect daily hardship to structural causes, and to imagine alternatives to the existing order. Consciousness transforms compliance into skepticism, and skepticism into resolve. Collective resistance without consciousness risks reproducing the very hierarchies it seeks to challenge. History shows that movements lacking clarity can be absorbed, redirected, or neutralized. Consciousness anchors resistance in an understanding of power, preventing it from being reduced to symbolic gestures or temporary concessions. It allows workers to recognize when victories are partial, when reforms stabilize exploitation rather than dismantle it, and when unity is being undermined by false solutions. As capitalism intensifies exploitation, contradictions sharpen, creating fertile ground for consciousness. Workers witness productivity rise while wages stagnate, wealth accumulate where insecurity spreads, promises repeated while conditions deteriorate. These contradictions provoke questions that ideology struggles to contain. Consciousness develops as lived reality clashes with official narratives, as experience exposes the limits of capitalist explanations. When workers begin to ask not how to survive within the system, but why the system demands so much and gives so little, consciousness takes a decisive step forward. Once consciousness spreads, resistance becomes possible, not as spontaneous reaction, but as deliberate action. Workers recognize themselves as a historical force capable of shaping society rather than merely enduring it. They understand that power does not reside only in institutions or capital, but in their collective capacity to produce, withdraw labor, and reorganize social life. Consciousness does not guarantee victory, but without it, resistance cannot sustain itself. It is the condition that allows solidarity to replace competition, strategy to replace desperation, and collective purpose to replace isolated struggle, as workers move from awareness to action, and from action to the possibility of transforming the very foundations of society itself. Liberation is not an abstract moral ideal or a gift bestowed by benevolent authorities. It is a material process achieved through organized class struggle. History demonstrates that no oppressed class has ever freed itself through patience, individual success, or appeals to justice alone. Power concedes nothing without pressure, and pressure emerges only when those who produce society's wealth recognize their collective strength and act together. Capitalism survives by isolating workers, but liberation begins the moment workers understand that their survival, dignity, and freedom are inseparable from one another. Class struggle arises from the basic contradiction at the heart of capitalism, the separation between those who own the means of production and those who must sell their labor to live. This contradiction is not theoretical. It is lived daily through low wages, long hours, insecurity, and dispossession. Individual resistance cannot resolve this contradiction because exploitation is enforced collectively through laws, markets, and institutions. Only collective struggle can confront a system that operates at a collective scale. Organization transforms scattered suffering into a unified force capable of challenging capital's dominance. The ruling class portrays class struggle as dangerous, divisive, or outdated because it directly threatens their power. They promote the idea that harmony between classes is possible, that shared national identity or personal ambition can overcome structural inequality. These narratives conceal the reality that class interests are fundamentally opposed. What benefits capital harms labor, and what liberates workers undermines profit. Organized struggle exposes this conflict, stripping away the illusion of neutrality and revealing society as a terrain of competing material interests. Without organization, resistance remains reactive and fragile. Spontaneous anger may erupt, but it dissipates quickly when met with repression or minor concessions. Organization gives struggle continuity, memory, and strategy. It allows workers to coordinate actions, protect one another, and sustain pressure over time. Through unions, councils, movements, and parties, workers develop the capacity to act not as isolated individuals but as a conscious class. Organization is the means by which workers turn potential power into actual power. Class struggle is not merely economic, it is political and ideological. It challenges not only wages and conditions, but the legitimacy of private ownership and hierarchical control. Organized workers begin to question why a small minority commands society's resources while the majority struggles to survive. They recognize that democracy limited to politics while excluding the economy is incomplete. Liberation requires extending collective decision-making into the realm of production itself, where power is most concentrated and exploitation most entrenched. The system attempts to neutralize class struggle by fragmenting it into single issues disconnected from material conditions. Workers are encouraged to seek recognition without redistribution, representation without control, reform without transformation. Organized class struggle resists this fragmentation by grounding demands in shared material interests. It links immediate struggles to long-term goals, connecting workplace grievances to broader questions of ownership, power, and social organization. Through struggle, workers learn not only what they oppose, but what they seek to build. Organization also transforms workers themselves. Through collective struggle, fear is replaced with confidence, isolation with solidarity, and resignation with purpose. Workers who once felt powerless discover their capacity to disrupt production, challenge authority, and shape outcomes. This transformation is itself a form of liberation, breaking the psychological chains that bind people to oppressive systems. Class struggle educates, radicalizes, and unifies, forging a collective identity rooted not in victimhood but in agency. Liberation cannot be achieved by escaping the system individually, because such escape leaves the structure intact and exploitation ongoing. True freedom is social, not private. It exists only when the conditions that produce exploitation are dismantled. Organized class struggle aims not to soften capitalism, but to overcome it, replacing a system based on profit and domination with one organized around human need and collective ownership. This struggle is not inevitable, but it is necessary because the existing order will not dissolve on its own. As exploitation intensifies and crises deepen, the necessity of organized struggle becomes clearer. Workers face a choice between continued subordination and collective resistance. Liberation does not arrive fully formed. It is built through struggle, shaped by conflict and sustained by solidarity. Each act of organization weakens the system's hold and strengthens the capacity of workers to govern their own lives. Liberation is achieved not through hope alone, but through disciplined, conscious, and organized class struggle that confronts power directly and refuses to accept a world where those who eat everything are denied control over anything. The truth that emerges from all of this is unavoidable. The system endures not because it is just, but because it is misunderstood. It thrives on doubt, disguises exploitation as failure, fractures workers into isolated competitors, suppresses consciousness, and fears nothing more than organized struggle. Every mechanism of capitalism is designed to prevent workers from seeing themselves as a class with shared interests and collective power. But history does not end with domination. When workers recognize that their suffering is structural, that their division is engineered, and that their liberation depends on unity, the foundations of the system begin to crack. Consciousness turns doubt into clarity, clarity into solidarity, and solidarity into action. The future is not written by those who own, but by those who produce, and once the working class understands this, organizes around it, and acts upon it, the power that once seemed immovable reveals itself as fragile, contingent, and ultimately conquerable.